Go.
Hi, I'm Steve Lohr. I'm moderating this panel. I'm a reporter for the New York Times. And the panel, as you know, is artificial intelligence, productivity, and diffusion. And we have a nice cross-section for this panel. We have two academics who study the field. Christina McElhern of the University of Toronto and Frederick Warzinski of the University of Aarhus in Denmark. We have one person who actually makes the stuff, Francesca Lazzari of Microsoft, she's a principal data scientist and she leads development teams for artificial intelligence and cloud computing at Microsoft. And we have one policymaker, Lucilla Scioli, who is the Director of Artificial Intelligence and Digital Industry for the European Commission. And now I'm going to pass it back to Flavio Calvino for a little setup of 5 minutes or so to set up our discussion later.
Thank you very much, Steve. Indeed, I will present a few slides to set the scene of this session before the panel discussion. So this session is going to focus on what we know about AI, productivity, and diffusion. We'll try to answer questions such as, who adopts AI? What is complementary to AI adoption? What barriers exist? What are the links between AI and productivity? What is the role of policy? How to foster a digital transformation that is inclusive and sustainable. In this context, OECD ongoing work, also supported by the German Federal Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs, touches upon several of these issues. In particular, a first project, AI Diffuse, is analyzing official data from ICT surveys using a newly developed distributed statistical code to characterize diffusion and its link with productivity, with initial evidence from pilot countries. In a second project, we are relying on a novel match of different exploratory and commercial data sources based on web scraping, job postings, IP, and financials to further explore AI diffusion and its applications. And in a third project, closing the Italian digital gap, supported by Italy, we analyze in depth the diffusion of digital technologies, their link with productivity, and the role of policies. And this analysis, done with Istat and the Bank of Italy, is about to be released next month. So, what do we see based on this ongoing work? We see that the diffusion of AI is still at relatively early stages across many sectors and groups of firms. When we look at the characteristics of AI adopters, we see that they tend to be more prevalent among larger firms, and there is a considerable share of young firms using AI. We see a significant sectoral heterogeneity, with higher shares in ICT and professional services. Adopters employ more ICT specialists, especially professional technicians and managers, and online vacancy data show that they seem to become more AI intensive over time. But it's not all about technical skills. OECD analysis shows that socio-emotional skills also play an increasingly important role. And this was emphasized also by Jim Best in the previous session. In addition, AI adopters tend to do more ICT training, tend to have a higher skilled workforce, possibly benefiting more from knowledge spillovers from universities. They also use more intensively other complementary digital technologies or tools, and they tend to export and have access to larger markets. What are the links between AI and productivity? What is key in this context is that diffusion across firms requires intangibles and human capital. And in particular, it takes time for productivity gain to materialize, especially for general purpose technologies such as artificial intelligence. And you can see a representation of this in the J-curve figure on the left. What do we see so far in our ongoing work? Well, we see some evidence of selection, with especially large AI actors that appear significantly more productive than their counterparts. This, however, may not reflect the role of AI alone, as there are a number of factors, including skills and other digital technologies that are complementary to AI and explain at least part of such selection dynamics. We are now further exploring more directly links between the use of AI and productivity growth, but at least so far, what our ongoing work seems to suggest is that returns to AI adoption may yet have to fully materialize. What is the role of public policies? Among the many challenges related to digital technology diffusion that policymakers face, one of them is surely a significant change in the demand for skills. Furthermore, OECD work has highlighted the role of winner-takes-most dynamics related to the digital transformation, and the weakening technology diffusion in increasing gaps between the most productive firms and the rest, increasing the polarization of economies. And these divergences have been likely amplified by COVID-19. And we see that, for instance, in our work on Italy. Several OECD studies on productivity and business dynamics have shown that public policy is key to boost diffusion of digital technologies and their returns. And in particular, no single policy, but a comprehensive policy mix, considering both demand side, supply side, incentives and capabilities, and importantly, complementarities in policy interventions would be needed. Such comprehensive mix may bring double dividends also in terms of inclusiveness. But as the paradigm increasingly shifts towards AI and its applications may become more and more pervasive, let me close with a couple of open questions. And in particular, what policy changes, if any, should be considered as AI increasingly diffuses? How to design policies that meet the challenges of the digital transformation in the age of AI, fostering inclusive and sustainable growth. So, and with these thoughts, this initial evidence and open questions, I leave the floor to Steve to start the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Flavio. Nothing left to do, but we'll try anyways. Let's start with our academic researchers. Christina, start with you. I mean, briefly describe your research. You know, what do you see? What stands out? What's significant, if not surprising?
There's a lot to unpack there. I've been working with the Census Bureau for quite a while now, trying to devise measures of emerging technologies, which means we're always a little bit behind the curve because this is moving so fast. But what we see in the data is that AI seems to be the latest incarnation of a series of digital technologies that build off of each other. So in a recent study we did of 850,000 firms across the US, and that's available in a working paper right now, we see low average adoption of AI-related technologies like machine learning and natural language processing and voice recognition, but that the adoption is correlated with a lot of other things like the availability of digital information. Cloud computing seems to be a very big deal, and I have some other work on that. And what we see overall is that the adoption rates, as Flavio said, are low on average, but it's very concentrated. And so we see this in larger firms. Interestingly, though, we see it in more innovative and dynamic firms who have complements related to growth strategy, who are led by firms whose motivations are centered around bringing ideas to the market or even contributing back to their communities, which I find very interesting. I think we need to learn a lot more about how the context of the organization drives this, because the heterogeneity among firms, I think, is really the headline here. Not the averages, but the variation. Who's adopting it? What are they adopting it for? How this goes along with innovation and growth, I think, really inform how we think about the impacts down the road, how we think about devising policy in this uneven and fast-changing environment.
Okay, great. Frederick, I leave the same question to you. You've been doing analysis with large data sets in Denmark, I gather. So what stands out to you? What are you learning?
Right. So it's only recently that we're able to measure properly AI adoption by firms, and I've been using data from the Denmark statistics that every year sends a survey to firms asking them about the adoption of ICT tools. And this question has only been asked since 2017. So we have really a very short period of time. But during this period of time, we have seen that the number of firms adopting AI has increased from 6% to almost a quarter of the firms that are surveyed. So we see this very rapid diffusion of AI. And one of the questions we're asking now is, what are the productivity implications of this adoption? Right.
Well, let me just ask you, and perhaps Christina, kind of follow-up question. In these surveys, is it the respondents who are determining what is AI? I mean, is this, how basic are we talking about? Because much of the adoption here is at things like what is called robotic process automation, which years ago Tom Davenport, who studies this, said to me that, he described it as the least intelligent form of artificial intelligence. I mean, it's, automating these, basic kind of back office tasks. And much of what we're calling, AI now is what we used to call data science, lots of data plus some machine learning algorithms. So when you talk about AI in this context, who's determining what's in the bucket and what's not?
That's a great question, because I think when we go to try to measure new technologies, especially as they're emerging, just finding the right language and the descriptions and getting sort of a general coalescing around these definitions is really important to grapple with, and it's important to understand how that could be impacting how we measure things. There's a tweet I love about this, is that when we are, when we're fundraising, it's AI, and when we're hiring people, it's data science, and when we're doing it, it's logistic regression. And so I think it's worth understanding that there's a lot of terminology that sounds very exciting and maybe threatening, but there's this long history of diffusion of general purpose technologies on which this is building. So we're not without tools and frameworks and language for understanding this. And we've seen, big software adoption has a big impact on process reorganization and innovation. AI seems to be related to this. And when, we get into the nitty gritty and the data, we don't wing around terms like AI. We ask about machine learning, natural language processing, voice recognition, trying to dig into sort of grounded descriptions of what's going on, so we don't get lost in some of the frothy, hypey language. But it's a great question. I think we have to be a little bit careful with our terms.
Right.
Frederick, anything to add on that front?
Yeah, to follow up on what Christina just said. So when firms receive the questionnaire, there's a clear definition of what AI means, and all the different components all the different tools that involve AI. And so they normally know pretty well how to answer that question. And Statistic Denmark makes sure that firms understand what they mean by AI. So
yeah, we do the same thing. We can't send these surveys out unless we talk to the respondents beforehand and make sure that the language there it makes them think about the same thing that we're thinking about. So we're all speaking the same language before this goes out into the world. These things are tested pretty carefully.
Okay, great. Let's move on to Francesca, the producer here. Francesca, you're building these tools. I mean, and in terms of diffusion or adoption, the key is going to be, how you democratize the production and use of AI technology. What do you see as key to that, and what are the bottlenecks?
Yeah, that's a very important question, especially for the industry. So I think that the key is really the capability of developing both low-code tools together with also what we call right now responsible AI tools. That basically they make our machine learning models more interpretable and easier to understand and consume. So I think that every time that we think about how we can democratize AI and machine learning, we really need to think about the audience that we are talking to. So for example, for professionals without a machine learning background, there are now many softwares that help with, for example, automatic feature engineering or automated model building. And because, as you probably know, machine learning as a technology has reached a point where feature engineering and model building can be done automatically with a high degree of accuracy. And so right now there are many tools in the industry that are either like open source or they have been developed by big tech company. Just to mention some of them, AutoML, automated machine learning. There are many drag and drop tools that of course offer users without a machine learning background the ability to build the models with a low code experience. On the other side, we have also developers, software engineers that are specialized in specific fields, and of course they also want to build the machine learning models. And right now there are many machine learning frameworks that solve specific specific machine learning challenges, and they can help us accelerate what we call the machine learning model development cycle. Some of these frameworks are, for example, TensorFlow, Keras, PyTorch. And so these are frameworks that, as a software engineer, you can just leverage, and you can easily, I would say, build machine learning solution, AI solutions, but still without building the algorithm from scratch. And so I think that the democratization of AI offers for sure two main benefits. The first is that I have been noticing that it reduces entry barriers for individuals as well organizations that they want to get started with AI. And the second, of course, is that also it reduces the overall cost of building AI solutions, because you have these now communities of programmers or of people, professionals also from the data industry, that they start using and building end-to-end machine learning solution. I also mentioned at the beginning of my answer the importance of the responsible AI tools. That is a topic that is very close to me, because of course with the democratization of AI machine learning, I think that there is also a risk, like for every single field. I think like there are many people that are going to build these solutions, and of course there are many different data that can be used to build those solutions. And so right now I have been noticing that in the industry there are many different tools that help data scientists and also people with without a machine learning background the possibility to understand, protect, and control the data that you use for your solution and also your solution themselves. Some of these tools, just to mention some, are, for example, InterpretML, error analysis, FairLearn. These are all Python packages, for example, that the open source community has been developing. So I think that going back to your question, I think that a good balance between the tools that allows the data scientists, data analysts, but also engineers to accelerate the development of machine learning solutions, together with good and solid responsible AI tools, I think is going to be the future to the democratization of AI.
Let me ask just one follow-up question, if I could, as to kind of where we are and who is actually using the spectrum of people using these tools now. I think of the personal computer era, and there it was the spreadsheet that really was the tool that really opened up computing to ordinary business people. And they could, if it could be conveyed in numbers, you could do if-then simple experiments and a lot more. And, you know, you mentioned low code, but where are we in sort of moving toward the equivalent of the spreadsheet in the AI world? You know, is it something that, you know, half the staff who graduates from, you know, from Harvard Business School, or 2/3 or 100% of them, you know, will be able to do as they would with a spreadsheet? And forget Harvard, any old, and you know, even people that have college educations. I mean, is this something that sort of ordinary people without a lot of mathematical and computing training are going to be able to do?
So this is another very important question. I think that when we look at the AI machine learning industry, we need to realize that there are a lot of different roles and professionals. So my answer to your question, my short answer is yes. I truly believe that in the near future, 100% of those students who are going to, for example, to graduate from a business schools or from different programs that are not like specifically in AI, machine learning, or computer science, yes, they're going to be able to build a machine learning application. However, those are not probably going to be the ones who are going to build the tools or who are going to develop the new algorithms that they are going to actually run behind those tools, those software that they have been leveraging in order to build those applications. So what I'm trying to say is that there is such a big need right now in the industry for professionals who understand how to build those solutions, that I think that those type of students with that kind of degree, they're going to be able at least to use some of the softwares in the industry to start experimenting with data and get much more insights from data. Of course, then there is another group of professionals that I have been mentioning a lot. Those are what we call right now the machine learning engineers. Those are the ones that build those applications that we are leveraging in the industry to really make AI a reality. Those are the ones that also are responsible for what we call the deployment of machine learning models. That is the operationalization part, which is a very, very difficult, or at least a challenging part of a piece of the machine learning development cycle. And then I want also to say that there are also what we call right now the MLOps managers, machine learning operation managers. And those are the ones that need to have an overview of the end-to-end machine learning solutions, because they're going to be the one who are going to help with the operations and also what we call the machine learning model governance piece of these solutions. So just to summarize, yes, I think that in the near future, there are going to be people also without a computer science, without a machine learning science degree, that are going to be able to build end-to-end machine learning solutions because of those tools that right now the industry is building.
Thank you, Francesca. Now on to policy. Lucilla, what's the appropriate role for government to play in accelerating the production and adoption of this technology? And what should government do? What should it absolutely not do? And if you can, drill down kind of one level give an example of each of those things.
Thanks a lot for this question. And let me build on what was said by the previous speakers. First of all, by saying that I'm not surprised to hear that there is not such a large take-up of artificial intelligence yet in our continent, because it takes time for technology to really diffuse. And I think that artificial intelligence as a general purpose technology will take probably even more time than others. You have to consider that it is applicable to many, many different economic sectors, from agriculture to financial services. So it has so many applications that it will take some time before we see the results in the statistics. And of course, in Denmark, we probably see it more than if we look at the European averages, simply because Denmark is a very advanced country in terms of digitization, probably one of the most advanced or the most advanced in the European Union. And therefore, the uptake of new technology is going to happen faster than maybe in other parts of Europe. Now, what can policy do? Well, first of all, policy has to stimulate the uptake of the technology. So, as Francesca also mentioned, it is important that artificial intelligence is accepted. We had a survey in Europe where 65% of business said that one of the main barriers they had was the fact that they didn't trust artificial intelligence. AI has this reputation that it may violate fundamental rights, violate safety. And so what the European Commission has done is that we have put on the table some rules to govern the use of artificial intelligence in certain contexts that we consider to be risky. And only in these cases, we think these rules should apply. And so this is the first proposal ever put on the table in the world in this area. And I think it will be very important for businesses also to feel more at ease when they're using artificial intelligence or adopting AI. A second important element in terms of acceptance is also awareness raising or helping smaller companies to uptake AI. Now, in the European Union, most of our companies, 99% of companies, are actually small, medium enterprises. So we need to help them to understand how they can use AI to become more productive. And for this, we have put in place a network of digital innovation hubs. These are technology organizations that really help companies to understand what data they have, what they can do with it, and so on. And thirdly, of course, data has to be available. So also here we have a data act that has just been published, which is going to help increase the availability of data for the use of companies as well. And last but not least, it was mentioned very clearly by the previous speakers, we need skills. And also here, policies on skills are going to be extremely important. I find it very important that all faculties, from medical to law school to all faculties include programming. And this will allow all the professionals to be able to work with AI. Maybe they will not have to program AI, but they will be able to understand how AI works, which risk it may bring, and be able to manage it and use it with trust. So I think these are the main elements of a policy framework for increasing the acceptance and the adoption of AI.
And when we think of government, people generally think of regulation, but I mean, in the European framework, I think there's some funding for it. The things called innovation sandboxes, and then test and experimentation facilities. I mean, can you elaborate a little on what those are? Because they seem to be the kind of things that are proactively helpful, and just at a glance looks like they're kind of creating a safe haven for people to experiment and not be held to some of the more restrictive regulations.
Yes, well, first of all, the regulation that you're talking about only applies to some very specific use cases of AI in certain specific contexts. For the rest, we stimulate the use of regulatory sandboxes to make sure that developers know what kind of impact that AI can have, and they can discuss also with data protection authorities to make sure that they're not going to have surprises once this has been put on the market. And the testing experimentation facilities, these are brand new facilities that we are supporting in agriculture, smart cities, manufacturing, and healthcare, to make sure that developers can also experiment with AI, including in physical places where they can experiment in basically the real world and see, and they're of course protected by a regulatory sandbox to experiment and see and validate the way the AI works. And then the European Union also supports a lot of research and development in AI, and I think this is important to highlight in Horizon Europe.
Thank you, Michelle. Let me ask our academics who have done these kind of surveys on, and I think, frankly, this panel is sort of good news panel. I mean, the later one is on discrimination. Knowing some of the other speakers, there's going to be plenty of discussion of inequality and competition issues. But Christina and Frederick, in your surveys, does this trust issue in some way, shape, or form come up? Since, there's two sides of this. There's the production, what's possible to do, and then there's the real world of absorption. And that you mentioned a number of organizational things, but I mean, is trust something that comes up in these surveys as a restraining force?
Well, for the U.S., we don't quite know yet. We have a set of questions on the Management and Organizational Practices Survey, the MOPS, that has gotten a lot of play, where we are looking, this is joint work with Nick Bloom and John Van Reenen, Eric Brynjolfsson, and increasingly others, Stephen Davis and Rafael Asadun, where we are trying to understand the management context in which this diffusion is taking place. We started with data-driven decision-making, which I think speaks to the human component here, where ultimately, unless we automate the decision, the action in response to the information, this is coming down to humans with capabilities, skills, and practices and routines. And I think we emphasize the routines and the processes in firms that also scaffold this activity. It's not down to individuals necessarily to do this right, but the organizational policies and regular practice of using data well, using data responsibly. We've been seeing this for a long time. We haven't asked about these sort of trust issues around AI until now, and that's sort of forthcoming, so you'll have to stay tuned. But I think if we look back to what we've seen before in terms of the ability to absorb and use data well, it does come down to these managerial practices, the ability to use data effectively and regulate, in decision making. And so I think, there's a trust issue, but there's also what I'd call a capability issue, a managerial capacity to absorb, use, leverage, and advance and control or monitor how this technology goes in. So I think it's not just the feelings of the people, but the practices in place that we need to get a better grip on. So that's where we're moving on the U.S. side. I think Fred has some good data from the European side.
Right. Well, first of all, I want to follow up on what Lucilia was saying. So trust is a key pillar in Danish society. And basically, this is probably one of the reasons why AI is so well accepted and so well adapted. Well, one of the factors why it is the case. And I feel that citizens generally trust the government and trust firms that they will not abuse the data that they have access to. And at the same time, recently, to answer your question, there are some questions about data ethics in the survey. So how firms feel that they ethically need to deal with the data. And also we have in the European Union this thing called GDPR, which is the protection of personal information, and that firms take very, very seriously. And it's one of the questions actually in the survey. How importantly do you take GDPR and do you enforce it? Yeah.
Thanks. And I mentioned to the audience here, I mean, if you have questions, we'll pick those up later. I mean, send them in. Otherwise, I'll keep droning on and the panelists won't have your excellent questions. Let me ask about cloud computing. Since this is essentially speaking of diffusion, this is essentially the operating system and the delivery vehicle for so much of this artificial intelligence technology. And Christina, you've done some research on this as to, and it's not all bad news.
It's not all bad news.
Why don't you elaborate on that a bit?
Well, what we found, and I think this is exciting and needs more work and needs some careful probing, but that when we look at the rise of outsourced IT services over the time where the cloud diffuses, we see this really fascinating shift in the survival and the productivity of young firms and young establishments of existing firms. And the reason the economists should get very excited about this is that the young are the source of economic dynamism. They are the source of job creation. They tend to be more nimble and more innovative, but they also tend to die faster. And so to provide a platform for rapid experimentation seems to really be shifting things for small and medium enterprises. And I think that's really something we could maybe lock on to as a policy tool, or thinking about infrastructure for helping democratize access to these new technologies is thinking about the inputs like cloud computing to the whole end-to-end data, cloud, algorithm, application use in firms. We have to bring all those pieces together, and I think the cloud infrastructure could potentially be a very exciting sort of injection at that low end of activity and dynamism that we're very worried about.
And I send that one over to Lucilla for the simple reason that Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, are you comfortable having this fundamental technology basically owned by 3 American companies?
Well, why not if they behave responsibly? I mean, we have, proposed some rules.
Don't police them.
Yes.
Okay.
And, we are not, the European Union does not have policies against particular companies. We just try to, introduce some rules that can govern the activities and the actions that existing companies put in place. So we are not going to have specific policies only against the GAFA or the Chinese big platforms. It's not the case, and it's not our intention. In any case, I think that what is important is that we also have other policies for example, Christina was just mentioning now the diffusion at the same time of the cloud, and that's all very important. And in fact, I don't think we should look at AI in isolation. We should look at the way AI diffuses as there is a stronger digital transformation of the whole economy. And I think that will be a very important element, as well as with, for example, investment in intangibles, which is also going to be very important for unlocking the productivity gains that artificial intelligence can bring to companies. And then other policies like taxation, for example, or redistribution. Sometimes you read on many articles indicating that these productivity gains of AI will bring lots and lots of profits to a very limited number of companies, including maybe the ones you mentioned. Well, then I think it's going to be very important that we have fiscal policies that can really redistribute these gains across our societies in a reasonable way.
Great. Let me ask one thing in Frederick's research that kind of struck me, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Frederick, there was what you saw in terms of the Danish firms that adopted it is that the skills development really built on other things, and in this broader digitization world generally, were a very good predictor for adoption, use, and effective use of this technology. I mean, and I think that's correct. And then what does it tell us about, you know, company training, incentives for, you know, time off for people to you know, to become more familiar with these kinds of things, and also then age differences in the workforce, sort of who, you know, who's likely to benefit, just as Christina was talking about young firms. I mean, I assume we're talking about, you know, sort of 20 to 45, right, for people. So, I mean, from a, you know, a skills human workforce and sort of, and in some ways, equality of opportunity issue. What are you seeing, Frederick, from that you know, skills related data?
Right. Great question. So first of all, let's establish the fact. So the firms that adopted first AI technologies were those that had more workers that were technologically advanced. And by that, I mean that in, you know, Danish registers, we are able to identify the occupation of workers, and we are able to categorize them into what we call the techies, people who have the ability to use computers and AI. And we see that those that adopted already had a larger component of these skills, and that these skills increase even more. They started hiring even more and more of these workers. So to go back to the policy obligations of our government is to basically facilitate development of these skills through the education system, and this is something that the government is doing. So of course, in practice, what you observe is that these top firms become more and more tech concentrated. Most of the youngly hired are younger, and you see obviously a bigger concentration of young workers in these firms. In the end, you end up in a situation a little bit like what we see at Amazon or Google in the movies. You have to entertain those techies and provide them a nice work environment, especially for millennials. And this is something that also Danish companies take very seriously. And it's not only in these industries, but also more generally in pharmaceuticals or more traditional industries. And also Danish society is a society that takes the share of your time between professional and personal life very seriously. And so there's a lot of flexibility at the workplace already. And so I guess in these companies, it's even more the case. Yeah.
Can I pile on there? Because I don't
Please,
think this is only a young person's story. In a piece that's recently so forthcoming in the Journal of Econometrics, my co-authors and I looked at big software investment, big capitalized software investment, which is not the same as AI, but I think we can look at other digital transformation activities as informative. And what we found there was that when we controlled for education and gender and a lot of things, and we're looking just at the age of the workers, we found this sort of good news, bad news story where the firms were sharing those gains with the workers, but primarily more of the middle career workers. So these were the workers who had enough familiarity with the technology, but also the tacit understanding of the business case. And I think this goes back to some of what Francesca was saying in terms of, it's not just the techies who are coding this, but the managers and the business savvy skills that really help with the application. They got these benefits. And so it's not just the young, hip techies who may be going to benefit. The downside was that as workers approached retirement age, so 65 and up, they did not benefit as well and more likely to leave. And so I think where we need to worry a lot about skills and job security is not just at the incoming part of this pipeline, but also let's not drop all of our older workers off the back of this fast-moving bus. So it's a good news, bad news story, Steve. It's not all the good news panel.
It's a good, no fear there. Well, Jill, you mentioned skills training and so forth, and endorsing that across the European nations generally. Anything specifically that looks like a kind of a neat idea to you as you look at that front? I mean, in this country, look, I've been writing about this for the last several years. I mean, a good problem. How do you find, train, and create pathways to good jobs in the modern economy for the 2/3 of people who do not have four-year college degrees? I mean, those cutoff points are a little bit different in different countries because it's defined differently. But it's largely kind of the same problem. And I'm just wondering if, just in looking at European countries, there are kind of, novel and encouraging experiments on that workforce front. Because if you can't put a dent in that problem, you've got all sorts of other problems, as we've seen.
Yeah, well, first of all, we should not try to think that we can reskill some of the people who may lose jobs because of automation and AI, because they just can't have the high level of skills that Francesca and Christina were mentioning, because they have low level of education. And so for them, there is a kind of different kind of thinking that has to be made by governments in terms of employing people that may lose their jobs, or they have low skills and they're not going to be able to be upgraded further. And then there is another kind of thinking to try to work on the younger population and try to incentivize them to undertake kind of studies that will lead them to these sort of careers as jobs are going to be there. Now, there are many examples, and I can mention, for example, I've seen that in Italy, they are offering scholarships for AI PhD students who can come from a variety of backgrounds. So they don't have to be people who studied computing science. They may have studied economics, they may have studied even law, but they have the possibility of doing a PhD. And I find that scholarships are very important, and scholarships can also help us to bring in a cohort of the population, which unfortunately is not participating as much as we would like to in digitization, and it is women and girls. And we have to attract more girls, and simply by attracting more girls, we would be able to have more talent in this particular field. So all those policies bringing programming in high school and even earlier is going to be really important to attract girls, and girls can really make us jump in terms of numbers when it comes to the talent pool. And I'm happy to see people like Francesca undertaking these careers. It's an honor to see that. And then maybe
one last,
yeah, and maybe one last policies I've seen that also works very well is when companies offer internships in digital, and so students before the end of their university have the possibility to spend 6 months or so in a company and working in the digital area. I think it's much more common probably in the United States than it is in Europe, but we have now through Erasmus Plus also these opportunities, and that's very important.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Not only the training, but kind of building two-sided markets. right? So people doing the training programs really understand what skills are needed and so forth. Francesca, let me send it to you. I mean, you teach as well as build. And these are college students. I gather some of them are undergraduates. What do you tell them about the future? I mean, you're teaching particular skills, but what's your message to them beyond that?
Thank you for this question. So first of all, I want to say that I totally agree with Lucilla that there is a big diversity problem in the industry right now, both here in the United States, I'm sure in Europe and everywhere. So what I wanted to say is that I also decided to go back to academia. So I currently work at Microsoft, but I also have an affiliation to Columbia University where I teach, as Steve said, applied machine learning and applied AI with Python. And sometimes I realize that in those classes, the number of female students, it's very, very low. And that it's something that, in my opinion, has to do more with a cultural shift that we need to support. There are a lot of communities around the world that really don't see for them a future in AI machine learning, because there is a part of the societies that have created this group that is basically unacceptable, not accessible for them, which is not true, because at the end of the day, I really believe that machine learning and AI, they all have like a common point, that is the capability of analyzing data. That is, in that moment, like there are many different professionals, many different students, as Lucilla was saying, that they can actually access that field. If you think about collecting data and start looking at the data, start getting insights from this data. And there are many different disciplines and many different fields of study that can help you with that. I personally come from applied economics, so I was a student who was just looking at the data and was trying to build models to get insights from this data. And then because I really needed to scale some of the solutions that I was building, I started learning R, Python, SQL, and then I started working the software and technology industry. But again, it's really about making sure that these tools that are about analyzing data, and making sure that after that you are able to build a model to predict something in the future based on the data that you have. All these tools, they need to be accessible. And I think that as a group of people who study this industry, we should do like a better job in supporting these different groups of the society, because we really need all of them, honestly, actually, also to build these tools. And then regarding the future of AI, I think that, again, what I tell my students is really about make sure that you are curious about the problem that you are solving, because AI, machine learning, right, big data, these are all fancy terms that at the end of the story, they just mean about getting data and answer a problem. It can be a scientific problem, it can be a business problem, but answer that problem with the data that you can collect. And then, of course, you need to study the different tools, the different softwares, the different programming languages, if you want, that they can help you answer that question. But the key is really about being curious and start with a problem that really is interesting for you. So at the end of the year, of the academic year, those students, they all need to present in front of me a project that they have developed end-to-end. And these projects, they come from like the healthcare industry, they can come from the robotic industry, from the marketing industry, from the fashion industry. So there are so many industries that right now are producing data. And I see that as soon as they get curious really about the problem they're trying to solve, then that barrier that the society created, it's really it's broken. And so we can see that there are more people that are contributing to this industry and to this field of study. Yeah, Steve, this is what I tell my students to do.
Okay, great.
Francesca, there's another piece you could maybe layer in here that I think is not getting enough play, which is that this is not all hard data. It's not all hard sort of cold logic that there's a soft side to understanding problems. There's a soft side to framing a problem. There's a soft side to getting information that can't be codified in data. And so we're seeing, when we look at the use of predictive analytics, that there's complements, there's reinforcing benefits of what we would call soft practices about getting, empowering employees to have voice in the firm and share, less structured, less formal information. And so I think if we have a stronger message that many types of skills, tacit knowledge, softer skills, an understanding what we can and cannot do with data, might open this whole box a little bit wider, more inclusively, and then I think we'd also do a better job with the data and the tools that we have at our disposal. So I think we can also improve our messages I'm an educator too, and I talk a lot to my students about, how do they think about their future in the digital world? And I think the digital workplace is going to admit a very broad range of people and skills and interests. We can do a better job with that.
We're getting a fair number of, thank you. Getting a fair number of questions from the audience here, so I'm going to filter some of those in. Now, one of this is how significant is the role of academia in AI development? And this is an active area that certainly the United States is a big deal, because the concern is that people, talent, and data are sucked by the big tech companies. Academia cannot compete. I've heard that, we've actually written about that. What's the appropriate role for academia in developing this, and sort of, where should they specialize? Because there are, and should there be rules for access to the big data sets, the giant data sets, and the computing firepower that the big tech companies have? And Lucio, we'll start it with you. I mean, do you have thoughts on this? Ooh.
Sorry, I didn't understand you meant me. Well, I think, in the European Union, we still have many researchers, I have to say, in artificial intelligence, and I cannot say that they're all the talent has been sucked away by the large companies, fortunately, for the moment. So,
despite Francesca.
Yes.
Our instance of one here.
No, but we do have, a lot of excellent research centers in artificial intelligence in the European Union, also because there is quite a lot of public funding for research, fortunately, in this area, and so we managed to keep them with us. Our big interest is to be able to become leaders, if you want, in the development of applications of artificial intelligence in industry. And therefore, what we do, for example, is to create very close bridges between the researchers and the researchers in companies, because of course, these are, foundational research and industrial research, and they need to speak to each other. And so we need research, and we need researchers, because we need better models for artificial intelligence. Maybe in the future they will use more data, less data. They will be maybe greener, and they will have simply new functionalities. We all need research in artificial intelligence, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic, and we both nurture it very much.
Francesca, let me just ask you a narrow version of that. I mean, there's a lot of debate about, moving beyond the tyranny of big data in terms of developing these models. And this kind of assumption has been that, you need massive firepower, you need enormous amounts of data to sort of make it work. But a lot of people in academia are working on research that, uses smaller sets of data just as effectively. Is there the prospect of a Copernican shift here, so that you know, the sort of that you know, we'll be better able to use smaller sets of data effectively, and therefore the big tech companies will not have the inherent advantage that they seem to have now?
I would say yes and no. Yes, if we are able to develop algorithms that are going to help us understand also from other data. So what I mean is, like, there is, for example, a nice and a very powerful technique right now in the machine learning field that is called the transfer learning. And this technique has been used and has been applied to many data sets that, you know, like researchers and professionals have been creating, but without a huge success in terms of collecting data. And so what you do, basically, you use a small amount of data, and then you look at what other companies, what other researchers have been doing with a similar type of data, but basically you use an algorithm that has been already trained, already used for these different type of data. So similar data, but different, of course, sources. So again, as the name says, we call it a transfer learning, in the sense that we are really transferring the process of learning from other application and data sets to the smaller data sets that you might have. So this is a way, in my opinion, that I think it can represent like a future, like, so using smaller data sets, but then at the same time, you have to make sure that other models that are already trained, so that they are already using data, they are like somehow public, and so that those companies or those researchers who do have like a smaller data set, they can at least access these models, these machine learning models, and these data set, and then somehow can leverage the public knowledge to derive insights and results. When I said no to my part of the answer is because I truly believe that instead of probably reducing the amount of data, we should make sure that there are policy in place in terms of privacy, security, and responsibility. And I truly mean that, in the sense that I truly believe that there should be like ways for scientists, data scientists, machine learning scientists, especially in specific fields like drug discovery, healthcare. In those fields, I think that we should be able to access the raw data in a way that, of course, is protecting the users or the customers, and also patients, which is the most important field, probably. And so this is why I say yes, but there should be like some exception in places for some specific fields where I really believe that getting the visibility into the raw data is going to represent a way for us as humans also to progress again in specific fields.
Great. A well thought out answer, Francesca. Let me, we're winding down here, but let me get in one other question from the audience here. If the managerial and organizational context is relevant to AI diffusion, should there also be regulation at that level as well as at the design stage? Anybody who wants to weigh in on this, go ahead.
If I may start, I'll be very quick, just to answer the second part, which is, well, first of all, management is very important for AI, for any digital technology. So the management makes decisions about investments. So if investment takes place in digital, it happens only when the management is convinced that that is a very useful and productive investment to make. But then when it comes whether the rules should apply to management, in fact, we think, well, our proposed regulation is all about the design of artificial intelligence, which, by the way, in a commercial setting. So maybe I should have clarified before that our rules do not apply to the research level of artificial intelligence. But it's important that in companies, there is a quality management system. So there is somebody who's actually, checking that the developments are taking place with respect to certain rules, which will then facilitate, it will increase the transparency and will facilitate traceability, and will also increase the acceptance as the application is used across the market.
So framework from government, and companies should have their own internal auditors to monitor seeing how this is done. Time is winding down. Actually, we have one. So the panelists have spoken for themselves. I'm not going to wrap up, but I'm going to ask the three panelists who are not policy people to make one recommendation for Lucilla, if they could, as to a policy step that would further accelerate the diffusion of this technology. Frederick, we'll start with you. Keep it short.
I didn't see that one. So yeah, try to continue facilitate the smooth adoption of AI technologies, mostly through the education system, and also by facilitating access and probably spreading to the role of large companies.
Okay, Francesca, you.
I think that it's going to be very important also to think about AI, not just a set of different tools that they don't talk to each other, but really as AI as a platform of tools that we need to know how to use together. And for this, I'm going to stress the importance of making sure there are professionals who are good at machine learning operations and machine learning model governance. And these two different areas, I think, are going to bring us also to a better consumption and distribution of AI systems. So that
Christina, I'm giving a warning that we're running over time, so keep it short, but you get the final word.
All right, thank you. So we've been working at Toronto to integrate thoughts around policy and practice, and I think it will come down to finding the right maybe metrics, incentives, so that we can enable firms of all sizes to do this well and effectively without putting too much friction in the way. So I think, the framework, the scaffold, the metrics, and having the right, costs and benefits so that this plays out in a inclusive and more democratized way, I think would be a great path forward. Plus, more cloud.
Great, thanks, guys. I appreciate the time of our panelists and the audience. And if we're running over, I apologize. Thank you all, Frederick, Christina, Francesca, Lucilla. Thanks very much for taking your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.